This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day, wherever you're listening from, and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. Okay, this week we're going to try a little something slightly different. We're going to flash back to a show we did almost 10 years ago now with Dr. Alan Zelicoff. This was from 6/27 of 2008. It was episode 87. And Alan Zelicoff was on talking about microbes. Are we ready for the next plague? And as many of you know, we had a recent interview with Dr. Zelicoff after the coronavirus started to spread throughout the United States and around the world. And we thought it would be interesting to go back and see what his predictions were 10 years ago and how close it was to being what we are running across right now. So Cliff's going to do the introduction with Dr. Zelicoff, but before we get started, we couldn't do IAQ Radio without our sponsors. They're the reason we continue to do the show for free.
IAQ Radio Association sponsors are the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. Learn more at acgih.org. The Cleaning Industry Research Institute. Learn more at ciriscience.org. The Indoor Air Quality Association. Learn more at iaqa.org. And the Restoration Industry Association. Learn more at restorationindustry.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories. Learn more at aemlinc.com. Particles Plus. Learn more at particlesplus.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com.
Alan P. Zelicoff, MD of Albuquerque, New Mexico, is a physician, inventor, physicist, author, and specialist in the control of biological weapons. He served as a senior scientist with the Center for National Security and Arms Control at Sandia National Laboratories. He has testified before Congress on public health issues and published op-eds in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and along with Michael Bellamo, authored 3 books: Microbe, Are We Ready for the Next Plague?, Doctor, Just Don't Do Something, Stand There, and More Harm Than Good, What Your Doctor May Not Tell You About Common Treatments and Procedures. Dr. Zelicoff, thank you for taking the time to speak with Joe and I and our listeners today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's get some basic background started. Can you tell us what is an epidemic and how does that differ from an outbreak?
They're really terms of art. An epidemic is a large enough outbreak to cause concern and a systematic response over a large area, say a state or a country. An outbreak is when an epidemiologist or public health official says there's an outbreak. And it can be one case when you're talking about something that is either highly lethal or very communicable. For example, measles. One case of measles in the United States would be considered literally a 4-alarm disaster that has to be addressed immediately. Whereas an outbreak of 100 people with a cold, while it's a communicable disease, since it has far less of an impact, doesn't engender the same response. So outbreaks are really when the local public health official says we have one. And an epidemic is generally regarded as an outbreak that is large enough to encompass a big region or an entire country.
What is a pandemic as opposed to the epidemic?
Pandemic, by definition, means it literally comes from the Greek pandemos, which means everywhere that there are people. And so, by definition, it's a multi-continent epidemic. So we have pandemics all of the time. They tend to be mild. So there are always pandemics, for example, of common cold viruses. But usually, the context in which the term is used is with regard to something far more consequential. A communicable disease like influenza, or God forbid, if anybody should reintroduce smallpox, which has been eliminated as a naturally occurring disease via an act of terrorism.
What about your opinion on how would the next pandemic would most likely occur?
we have so few pandemics of consequence to point at that it's an interesting discussion question, but very difficult to get a precise answer. But here's what I think history tells us. It is almost certainly going to be the case that the next pandemic, which by definition is in people, pandemics refer to people, whereas panzootics would refer to animals or birds, will almost certainly start off as a disease in animals and probably in birds. So classically, the pandemics of history that we're aware of are influenza, the plague, which still exists as a naturally occurring organism and always will. It cannot be eradicated from the environment. And then, of course, smallpox was a pandemic until the early part of the 20th century and was finally eliminated in 1977. Now, both plague and influenza, which still circulate, of course, and always will, because they have a natural animal host or hosts, both of these diseases are mutable, meaning the organism that causes them tends to undergo mutation far more commonly, by the way, for influenza than for plague. And so my guess is that if we have another pandemic, meaning a serious disease that affects people all over the globe, it will be one that probably originates in the animal population. And this is why a number of people have recently recognized the importance of not just doing disease surveillance in the human population, which we do very haphazardly, some places good, most places not so well in the United States in particular, but also monitoring the health of the animal population, which is something that is often overlooked. So there's almost a wall. It's embarrassing to say as a professional, but there's almost a wall between physicians and veterinarians. They just don't talk to each other. Yet they both have quite a bit to offer each other, and it is likely that the next pandemic disease is first going to be recognized in an animal population, and that, of course, will be almost certainly done by a veterinarian.
But before I ask you my question, there's something that you said that struck me. You commented that plague can never be eliminated, and I just wondered why.
Well, it's endemic in a number of rodent-like populations, ground squirrels, for example, prairie dogs, and unless you can envision eliminating all the ground squirrels in the world, which is just physically impossible, then the natural reservoir for the most common form of plague that we know about, the kind that tends to cause bubonic plague in humans, meaning infection in the lymph nodes that can then disseminate into the bloodstream. Unless you can envision some way of getting rid of all the ground squirrels, and why would you want to do that a priori? That would be an undesirable thing to do environmentally. Then you simply can't get rid of the natural reservoir. The distinction with smallpox is that smallpox is was a human-only disease. There was no natural reservoir for it. And the other organisms for which this is true are measles and polio. So we're getting very close to eradicating measles and polio as naturally occurring diseases in humans, because humans are the only hosts, at least we think that's the case. It was certainly the case for smallpox. But because plague and influenza, for example, are naturally occurring diseases in non-human animals, you simply can't eliminate the natural host. Nor I would posit would you ever really want to.
What is a zoonotic disease?
By definition, it's a disease whose natural host is not human, but which can get into the human population. So influenza is the classic zoonotic disease. It is a disease of birds. There are multiple variants of influenza because, as I mentioned, the virus itself mutates quite frequently and often mutates in such a way as to be a viable organism that can go on to infect birds that have been infected with other varieties of influenza in the past. And it occasionally gets into the human population. So when we, from the human perspective, from the anthropomorphic perspective, if you will, talk about zoonotic disease, we're talking about diseases that, generally infectious diseases that occur in animals that occasionally get into the human population. People in your part of the country may be familiar with a big outbreak of a zoonotic disease that took place in Milwaukee in 1994, if I recall correctly. And it was an amoeba-like organism, a protozoa-like organism called cryptosporidiosis, a big long name, that causes a mild diarrheal illness in cattle and calves. But when it got into the water supply in Milwaukee, and due to apparently a dysfunction in the water purification system, it got into the human water supply, and it caused a unsettling disease in several 100,000 people, and in people who were immunocompromised, people with cancer, some people who were HIV positive at the time. It actually caused several hundred deaths. So that's a classical example of a zoonotic disease that has one other characteristic about it that is particularly worrisome, which is that the vector involved in transmitting that disease was something that's ubiquitous, which was the water supply. So that is a particularly lethal combination when you have a zoonotic disease, a disease of animals, that also has a vector that can transmit it into humans. And there, the classical example, one that everyone has heard about, is malaria, and in the United States, West Nile fever, which is a disease of birds. It doesn't directly get into humans, but if mosquitoes bite birds, they can pick up the virus, and then if they bite humans, they can transmit the disease to humans. So there's a zoonotic disease with a vector, and it often causes very serious disease in humans.
Doctor, should the American, while we're talking about these zoonotic diseases, should the American public fear the avian flu, the H5N1?
Not this particular avian flu, not the H5N1 in my view. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this, and a lot of money has been spent on preparing for a possible pandemic from H5N1. Let me give you a bit of background, if that's okay, so that listeners understand the distinction among all these flavors or types of influenza that are out there. Influenza, as I said, is a naturally occurring bird disease, and the virus itself, when it multiplies inside of the cells of the bird's respiratory tract or the gastrointestinal tract, often undergoes mutation, simply because it's RNA, its genetic material. When it is reproduced, often is reproduced with copying errors, literally in the process of reproducing the RNA, that are not corrected for by any metabolic machinery in the virus or in the host cells. Well, what this means is that new types of influenza that have different characteristics, and in particular have different coatings on their surface, can emerge, and from time to time, these new influenza viruses cause massive bird die-offs, and we have seen huge numbers of birds dying from H5N1 because they're not immune to the new type of influenza that has come about. And on very rare occasions, will directly enter into the human population and also have the characteristic of being transmissible from human to human. That's what happened in 1918. Or we believe so. A direct introduction of a new bird flu virus into some small number of humans that just so happened to cause both highly lethal disease or highly mortal disease, and also happened to be transmissible. So you need at least three things for a pandemic to occur. Probably more, but at least three we're all agreed on, which is that it's a new type of virus to which humans do not have immunity, that's in the bird population. Second, that it gets from the bird population either directly into humans or via some intermediate host into humans where it presumably adapts, such as in pigs or occasionally in other mammals. And then finally, it has to be able to transmit from human to human. those are three big steps. And the pandemic of 1918 that many people have read about, many people in the Pittsburgh area, for example, died from. I know of two of my relatives who died in 1918 from the influenza pandemic, is a statistical outlier. It is simply an extraordinarily rare event. Now, where reasonable people disagree is, even though it's an extraordinarily rare event, if it does occur, the consequences are so high that the impact would just be so enormous, even though it's an unlikely thing to occur, that we need to prepare for it. Where I tend to differ from most of the scientific opinion, although it's slowly been changing over the past 2 years, is that it struck me when H5N1 first appeared in approximately 1997, even though it did in fact get from birds directly into humans, we had pretty good epidemiological evidence for that. It wasn't transmitting at all well from human to human, and one more important factor was there are many, many contacts every day, particularly in Southeast Asia, which is where this virus arose, between birds and humans, because most people who buy birds for consumption buy live birds, literally in live animal markets, something that's not very common in the United States. Well, there were many hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions, of interactions on a yearly basis between birds and humans, yet we only had a few dozen cases back in the late 1990s. And it simply struck me that there must therefore be already existing an inherent immunity in humans, probably because of exposure to previous strains of influenza that were close enough to H5N1 so that we had either antibodies or other immune responses that would render us effectively protected against H5N1. And the good news is that since I first put this hypothesis forward, and it really didn't get me any Christmas cards from my friends at Public Health, a number of experiments have been done in animals, and also some experiments have been done with human white cells, literally taking the white cells from a random selection of people in North America to see if their white cells would kill the H5N1 virus. And the good news is almost everybody in the United States, at least those people who are adults, we haven't done the testing with children's white cells yet, have immunity to H5N1, at least in the Petri dish. And with the experimental evidence that we've been able to do in animals, by immunizing them with the standard garden variety influenza that is already circulating in humans, they are then protected against H5N1. So the original observations that I put forward in 2002 or so have now largely been verified. Now, I am not here to say that it's impossible for H5N1 to undergo further mutations to make it both infectious for humans, avoid the immunity that currently exists, and also become transmissible from person to person. Could that happen? It could. It's impossible to prove a negative. It's just extraordinarily unlikely, and we have many more important things to worry about that we're unfortunately ignoring, and we're spending still a tremendous amount of money preparing specifically for an H5N1 pandemic. Now, some people would then go on to argue, even if that turns out to be correct, that there is not going to be a pandemic of H5N1, having gone through the exercise of preparing for a pandemic is a good thing, and it was a responsible use of resources. And I partially agree with that. We should be prepared for a pandemic. Unfortunately, much of the money that we've spent is directed almost exclusively at the detection of and vaccines for H5N1 alone. And that is where I differ with many people in the public health community.
So you've answered this in a way already, but I just want to clarify, are the pathogens which can cause these pandemics, are they geographically isolated or are they everywhere?
Well, birds are everywhere, aren't they? And so if if H5N1 gets into long-distance migratory birds, there's a reasonable concern that it will eventually show up in North America, because migratory birds, some migratory birds literally migrate from pole to pole, so we're talking many thousands of miles, and they tend to intermingle with birds that are that have similar migratory routes or where the migratory paths cross. So that was another reason that was put forward, that it's only a matter of time before H5N1, which is found throughout Southeast Asia, and a small amount now in Eastern Europe and in North Africa, will eventually arrive in the United States. Even that, though, I thought was probably not correct, because we've not seen that with other influenza viruses. It only occasionally happens that birds will somehow cross-infect other birds, and that new strains of influenza will become ubiquitous. It does happen, but it's rare, and we haven't seen it yet in the United States. It's unlikely that we will, and to the extent that we have seen it in Europe, primarily Eastern Europe and North Africa, it seems to have occurred mostly because of trade in poultry, that is to say, in the meat market, effectively, not due to bird migrations. And you may say, well, why is this? And part of the answer appears to be that if the H5N1, the virus in the birds, is pathogenic, meaning causes bad disease in the birds, well, then they can't migrate long distances. Or to put it very simply, dead ducks don't fly very well. and so it appears, despite the fact that the virus has been endemic in the bird population now since at least 1997, and probably well before that, we still have no evidence of it at all in North America. Could it happen? It could. And if you're a chicken, you're in trouble if that happens. But as far as humans are concerned, even if H5N1 enters into the population of birds, I don't think humans are at risk. There's one other point I want to make about this, because we have a similar pathogen, an influenza virus that's related to H5N1. It's called H5N2, and that's simply referring to a slight change in one of the two main molecules on the surface of the virus that is in the United States. And it does cause disease in birds. And it does cause disease in birds that are important for human consumption. So I'm talking about primarily chickens, other poultry as well, but primarily chickens. So in the southeast United States, we do have H5N2. Therefore, because veterinarians take care of these enormous flocks of birds, you might be talking about 100,000 or more birds in a chicken laying in an egg laying facility or in a chicken raising facility, you might expect then, since it's a new influenza virus and humans are having direct contact with it, that some of the vets would get sick. Well, no vets have gotten sick. But when we look at those vets and test them to see if they have antibodies against H5N2, which is very closely related to H5N1, we find that at least 30% of the vets, it's probably higher now, this is a 2-year-old study, at least 30% of the veterinarians taking care of animal flocks, primarily chickens, with a closely related H5N2 virus, have antibodies against H5N2, meaning they had to have been infected, but none of them got clinical illness. And that's exactly what is happening with H5N1. People are in fact getting infected because they come in contact with birds, but only rarely do they develop clinical disease. Why? Because they already have immunity to, at least a partial immunity to the virus, so that they can then develop fully protective antibodies against the virus. And we already have a model of it now in the United States for H5N2. So one more reason why I'm not particularly concerned about H5N1, but I am concerned about the general problem of pandemic infectious disease and our lack of preparedness for it.
Well, we're going to talk about bioterrorism and suggestions for fixing the problem in the second half of the interview. I think what we'd like to do is bring our technical director, Dr. Weil, on and see if he has any comments on the first half.
Hello, Dieter.
Yep, I just got unmuted. Well, I'm obviously not an expert in infectious diseases. In fact, while I was listening, I was trying to find, I lost a book. It's called, published by the World Health Organization, Control of Communicable Diseases, I think. I don't know what I did with it. I once took it to some seminars what I gave, which I was giving, but I couldn't find it on the website. Anyway, that kind of goes into my direction, and Joe knows that. I'm against over-vaccination, and I think our bodies are quite well equipped to. I like to make my own antibodies. They are tailor-made by my body, and I think they worked quite nicely for me. And I think we sometimes overdo it, and we may even affect our immune systems when we are trying to do something that our body really didn't want to do. So I remember the wise words of a biology teacher, said whenever you fool around with Mother Nature, you will lose very often. And you got to be careful over there.
Okay. I think those are wise comments.
Thank you, Dieter.
Okay.
Okay.
Gentlemen, let's take a quick break. We have to thank our sponsors again before we get to the second half of the show.
IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus engineers and manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at aemlinc.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at iaqa.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry. Network with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org. CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at ciriscience.org. That's CIRI science.org. ACGIH, advancing the careers of professionals working in the environmental health, industrial hygiene, and safety communities. Interested in defining their science at acgih.org.
Well, I think this subject is on everyone's mind, and it's bioterrorism, and we'd like to move into that. Dr. Zelicoff, would an intentional event, bioterrorism event, seem any different than an accidental or a natural occurring event?
Oh, it's a great question. And like all great questions, the answer begins with it depends. Likely not. It would not look different from what might be interpreted as a particularly bad cold virus, or maybe even a localized outbreak of influenza. And the reason I say that is that most of the scenarios by which bioterrorism might take place are via the aerosol route. So take an infectious organism, or even a toxin, but usually this is talked about in the context of infectious organisms, and aerosolize it in such a way that it can spread reasonably long distances, let's say a few miles, which would, of course, infect tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in a densely populated city. And, of course, almost independent of what the organism would be, when it's inhaled, it will present with, and presuming it's infectious, it will present with a cough, a fever, and perhaps changes on a chest X-ray. So it will initially be seen as, well, probably a pneumonia, community-acquired pneumonia, or maybe influenza, or maybe a new strain of influenza, or a particularly bad cold virus, or perhaps a novel new virus like the SARS virus from just a few years ago. That's the way it'll probably present. You could think about the possibility that bioterrorism could take place through the food supply or through the water supply, in which case it will probably present as a gastrointestinal illness and will likely be written off as, well, a bad stomach virus or something like that. The key to making the diagnosis, or maybe better said, raising the suspicion that there is a bioterrorism event taking place, is if a cluster of people who are otherwise healthy all get ill at the same time. So it's pretty rare for healthy adults or healthy kids, especially healthy adults, to come down with a severe respiratory illness that takes them to the hospital and gets them admitted to the hospital. Pretty rare for that to happen. And I would say in a city the size of Albuquerque, where I am, which is about 400,000 people, or the greater Pittsburgh metropolitan area, or even a city as large as Los Angeles, if 5 or 6 people showed up in area hospitals who were otherwise healthy, who all had a very bad respiratory illness, so bad that the doctor felt they needed to be admitted, just a handful, 5 people in a 24-hour period, I would posit to you that that's a very unusual event. Now, it's not unusual for people to get colds or to get mild coughs and a sore throat. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a severe enough set of symptoms. We call it a syndrome in the disease monitoring world, that makes the doctor in the emergency room, or perhaps even a vet who's seeing this an animal who has similar symptoms, very worried. Worried enough to perhaps do unusual diagnostic tests that wouldn't normally be ordered, and also to admit them to the hospital. And I would posit to you that half a dozen cases like that in a city the size of Pittsburgh, maybe a few more in the city the size of Los Angeles, would be extraordinarily unusual and should raise the alarm. Now, lest someone think that this is a silly statement, think about what happened in New York City when West Nile fever, which is a virus disease, somehow got introduced into the bird population in and around the Bronx Zoo back in the late 1990s. What happened there was that birds started to die. A veterinarian who worked at the Bronx Zoo noted that 2 North American birds, not zoo birds, but North American birds, died. And those 2 birds were enough for her to say, this is so unusual that I'm going to actually do an autopsy or a necropsy on these birds. And what she found with these 2 birds was that they both had severe inflammation of their brains. And that was so unusual, just 2 birds, that she then went the next step, which was to do something that isn't usually done, to get an electron microscope of samples from these birds' central nervous systems, and she saw virus particles, and she said, oh my God, there's something terrible going on here, because birds don't usually die from what is encephalitis and inflammation of the brain in short periods of time. At the same moment, almost within a few weeks, 2 humans, both elderly, were admitted at 2 separate hospitals. I believe they were on Long Island, but certainly in the New York City area, with encephalitis. But because they were in 2 separate hospitals, and because we have no systematic disease surveillance system based on syndromes like encephalitis, which is not a diagnosis, it's a description of what's going on, none of the public health officials in New York City were aware of these 2 isolated cases. But I would bet you today that if 2 people who are otherwise healthy showed up in 2 separate New York area hospitals with encephalitis, and that was reported to public health officials, and they showed up within 24, 48 hours of each other, there would be an instantaneous investigation, and unusual diagnostic tests would be ordered to try to see if there was an unusual agent involved. But still today, we don't have the ability to do that. So to summarize, bioterrorism could appear in multiple ways, and the key is that it will almost certainly be an unusual agent, an unusual organism, that we typically don't do diagnostic tests for, the doctors don't see and therefore don't recognize, because you see what you know and you know what you see in medicine, just like in anything else, any other profession. And it will be overlooked unless we have some better, more general way of capturing the fact that otherwise healthy adults are suddenly ill with an unusually severe set of signs and symptoms, which we call a syndrome.
Now, I've got a follow-up on that, Doctor. The group of people we deal with do indoor environmental quality. They deal with indoor environmental quality issues. And this is a little off the subject today, but I want to ask a quick question. It seems to me that you feel that a bioterrorism event would be more likely to occur in the outdoor air than somebody intentionally causing a problem within a building, let's say of 70 stories or whatever, because it wouldn't be detected as quickly. Is that accurate to say? Is that?
I didn't mean to give that impression. I can see how you might have gotten that. I didn't mean to say that it would that a bioterrorism event would most likely occur in the outdoor environment. In fact, I think that it is more likely to occur in a semi-enclosed indoor environment, meaning a large building. And indeed, the one bioterrorism event that we have had in the United States, clearly an intentional act of introduction of disease on a large scale, was at the Senate Hart Building back in 2003, when anthrax was mailed to 2 senators, and the organism, which is a spore, so it's inert until it comes in contact with tissue, was in a form that made it easily aerosolized when the envelope was opened. And from 2 or 3 envelopes, we don't know exactly how many, but there were at least 2 envelopes that had anthrax spores in them, the entire Hart Building, the Senate Hart Building on Capitol Hill, was contaminated. And as a result of that, many hundreds of people were exposed to anthrax, and in fact, we know of many hundreds who had some anthrax spores in their noses. So an indoor environment where the air is recirculated, particularly if it's a very fine particle aerosol, something on the order of a couple of microns in size, can rapidly disperse throughout a building, sometimes can disperse throughout the building before the HVAC system has a chance to eliminate that organism. And we've even seen the same thing, albeit unintentionally, with disease that's occurred in airplanes. Tuberculosis being the leading example of one infected person in an airplane contaminating the air in an obviously enclosed environment and infecting multiple other people.
Do you lose sleep over this?
I do.
Okay. And anything in particular, any organism in particular that gives you nightmares?
It's not so much the organism in particular. Rather what it is our continuing spotty ability to identify unusually ill people or animals and get that information dispersed to decision makers in a timely way. That's what keeps me awake at night. So even if we never have a bioterrorism event, it's sobering to realize that in the past 3 years, we've had foodborne outbreaks of salmonella just in the past 2 months, and we still don't know where that outbreak started. Last year it was E. coli, and at about the same time last year there was a small outbreak of foodborne botulism, which killed a few people. And the E. coli outbreak hospitalized quite a number of people and resulted in severe morbidity, and in this case renal failure, in a bunch of people who were infected. Yet it took us weeks to become cognizant of what was going on, because we have no national infectious disease surveillance and information dispersal network that works. And so therefore isolated cases were thought to just be isolated cases. There was no recognition for several months in each of these outbreaks that there was in fact a national problem. That is what keeps me awake at night. Because even if we never have a bioterrorism event, it's certain we're going to have an inadvertent foodborne outbreak of disease, or we may have introduction via the bird population or the animal population of another novel zoonotic disease, like occurred with SARS, for example. SARS is an instructive example in sort of the opposite way, which is that people got sick. It was recognized that people were getting sick, albeit a little bit after the initial cases occurred. But because we had no systematic surveillance in Asia or in the United States or even in Canada, which is where most of the North American cases were, it was feared early on and for many weeks after the initial identification of this strange new novel disease that it was the next long overdue pandemic of influenza. There is a pervasive belief among some people in the public health community that pandemics occur at more or less regular intervals. There's absolutely no evidence for that, by the way, but there's still a belief, long held, almost a mantra, that pandemics will occur and we're overdue for one. So here was an example where we had introduction of an organism that looked like influenza, it wasn't, that we reacted to as if it were influenza, and we restricted travel and trade that cost who knows how many tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, when it was blatantly obvious from even the minimal amount of disease surveillance that was being done at the time that this was not a human-to-human communicable disease, that it was not the next pandemic of influenza. So a good disease surveillance system not only can help you identify something when there's a problem, which is what we as humans tend to be most concerned about, but it also tells you when there isn't a serious problem or one that you need to ring the alarm for. That turns out to be actually a much more costly and much more common problem in daily public health, the so-called false alarm or false positive. It's the bane of the existence of public health. And what a good surveillance system almost certainly will be able to do is to keep us from spending time and precious resources when we don't need to. It will tell us in a timely fashion what the dynamics of the disease are. How fast is this growing? And when you go back and you look at the SARS data, this was before even the organism was identified, so we just had a syndrome, a description, which was healthy people with bad respiratory illness who shouldn't have bad respiratory illness who traveled to Southeast Asia or had contact with someone who did. That was SARS, the severe adult respiratory syndrome. If you look at all those cases as they were reported, well, the cumulative number of cases grew in a perfectly linear fashion. That's not at all what you would expect with influenza if it were communicable from person to person. It would grow much more rapidly than linear. So a good surveillance system at the time could have told us what we weren't dealing with. It might not have told us what we were dealing with, but it could have kept us from making decisions that ended up being very, very costly.
Well, you seem to have already commented on the current state of disease reporting in the U.S., and it's not very encouraging, I guess. What's the elapsed time at this point in time for determining whether there is one of these pandemics or epidemics?
We don't have a lot of data to say, so it's a bit speculative. But based on the foodborne outbreaks that we've had, it's many weeks to several months. That's many weeks too late. If heaven forbid we should be dealing with a communicable disease, or God forbid a bioterrorism, an intentionally introduced organism that either could be communicable or would have high lethality unless it were treated very early on in its course. So I'm going on recent experience, despite the fact that we allegedly have surveillance in major hospitals and a few large clinics around the country. That information, even when it arrives to state and federal public health officials, seems to get stuck somewhere. And it isn't turned around and then dispersed to people who need the information in a timely fashion. It's on the order of weeks. What we need is that information to be dispersed in the order of hours to days at most if we are going to effectively respond to a pandemic when we have the ability to contain it, or a bioterrorism event when we have the ability to prevent it from causing severe mortality or morbidity.
Can you suggest how the system could be improved?
Well, I have personal experience with this, so I'm a little bit biased, but we have really good data now after 5 years of operating a system that's very different from what exists with the CDC and with most states in the northwest portion of Texas. Instead of depending on laboratory-based diagnosis, which is essentially what most of our surveillance is, and instead of depending on time trends in diagnosis codes that are scribbled down by harried physicians in emergency rooms, which tend to be very inaccurate or sometimes not very timely. What we've done in Northwest Texas over the past 5 years is we've put on the desktop of computers dozens of doctors and also veterinarians in the Northwest Texas area, so roughly an area that has about 1 million people living in it and heaven knows how many animals, where physicians in about 15 to 20 seconds can report a case that they regard as unusual, meaning unusually severe or with unusual signs and symptoms. They don't have a diagnosis. They don't know the organism. They don't have a blood test that specifically tells them what is going on. Rather, what they do is they report signs and symptoms. Signs are what the doctor finds on exam. Symptoms are what you complain about. And they report them in people that they judge to be seriously ill. And we've had 3 major successes with this approach. And the name of the system is called the Syndrome Reporting Information System, or SIRIS for short. And it's, as I say, it's been used now by 2 large public health jurisdictions in Texas for 5 years, and they're doing it not as part of an experiment. They're doing it because they need to have good disease surveillance in the area. And they adopted the system because they believe, and now the data supports the fact that it works. We've had 3 major successes with SIRIS. The first was there was a bioterrorism, an apparent bioterrorism event in 2003 when a physician at the medical school at Texas Tech reported to the local FBI that strains of plague that he had collected from around the world, he was an expert in plague, had disappeared. And as you might imagine, this made the FBI rather nervous, especially at the time, because we were in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and it was a very, very uncertain time. And the FBI, of course, notified the local public health department. But because our system was running, the local public health department was able to monitor the human and animal population. Plague, after all, could affect animals if it were dispersed intentionally into the air or even into the food or water supply. And they were able to see immediately that there was nothing going on. And they were able to apprise clinicians literally on an hour-by-hour basis of whether or not they were seeing anything that even remotely resembled any of the forms of plague. And the bottom line was not a single dollar was spent doing unnecessary diagnostic tests anywhere. The acid test wasn't beating the standard public health surveillance to the punch. The acid test was beating CNN to the punch, and they did. So that was the first example. The second was early identification of an influenza outbreak at a time when it generally doesn't occur in Texas. And probably the most significant one was during Katrina. You remember that terrible disaster where many thousands of people had to be evacuated from New Orleans. Well, it turned out about 800 of them ended up in an abandoned Air Force base as evacuees in West Texas. And they had been stressed. They had been subjected to God knows what kind of organisms walking through sewage water and seawater. And many were ill when they arrived at this abandoned Air Force base where they were cared for several weeks in West Texas in 2005. Well, of course, public health officials were very concerned since there were 800 people, all of whom had been exposed to multiple organisms, crowded together, that they might have communicable infectious disease problems on their hands. And so they immediately installed this disease surveillance system on the computers at the little medical clinic that was an ad hoc medical clinic set up at the Air Force Base. And they were able to determine very rapidly whether or not they had a communicable infectious disease problem on their hands. And they were also able to apprise physicians of the unusual infectious diseases that none of the physicians had ever seen before that could be in the population. And so it was a dramatic success in two ways. People who were truly ill with unusual organisms were appropriately treated, and no unnecessary tests or antibiotics were used, because it became very, very clear early on that there was not communicable infectious disease among these 800 people. So those are our three successes, and I think they're rather potent.
It sounds to me like one of the keys to your fix for this problem is to tie together the veterinary world and the medical community. Is that happening in other parts of the country other than Texas and the area where you were working?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no. Unfortunately not.
And that would be probably one of the, I'm assuming one of the things you would recommend we get on.
Oh, absolutely. All of the diseases, all of the infectious diseases that have caused serious problems, mostly economic, but which have been disruptive in the United States in the past, 10 to 15 years, have all been diseases, with only one exception that I can think of, that were zoonotic, meaning they started off in the animal population. And so to not have real-time disease surveillance in both animals and humans is to completely miss the boat. One other example that I'll quickly mention was there was an animal imported from Central Africa that brought a disease into the country called monkeypox, a disease that sort of looks like smallpox. It, thank God, isn't smallpox, but what sort of looks like smallpox and is infectious for humans, and on occasion can cause very bad disease in humans. And this animal infected other animals in animal stores, including prairie dogs, which are adopted as pets, bought as pets, traded in pet shows and trade shows in the Midwestern portion of the United States. And monkeypox occurred in some humans, was of course misdiagnosed, and nobody knew where it came from. And that's because there was no animal disease reporting, and it was only in retrospect that we knew. Well, unless you know where the monkeypox is coming from, since we don't have any antibiotics to treat it and we don't have any vaccine for it, at least not one that we would feel comfortable giving, you have to identify the source of the disease in order to stop it from spreading. And it was only by really a series of fortunate, lucky events that the disease didn't spread further in the human population, and it was finally recognized what the original source was. But once again, it took weeks.
Let's go to the Roundup here. We have a segment of the show where we bring everybody back together and ask a few final questions. All right, we've got everybody unmuted now, and let's start with Dr. Wow. Any questions or comments for Dr. Zelicoff?
Oh, certainly, a bunch of them, and I must say I agree with a lot of things he said. If an MD today is expected to see 250 people in one day, he is overworked. I don't care what other name you give it. But he mentioned in passing that even if you were to distribute an aerosol of small size, 3 micrometers or thereabouts in diameter or thereabouts, unfortunately, there isn't an HVAC system anywhere in the country. There may be one in a nuclear power plant that will filter out these particles. In other words, a normal heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system is actually a wonderful distribution system for any nasty things that somebody may introduce near the fan of that system, because the filters are just not designed for that. And Joe has heard that from me several times. Most of the filters that we have protect the equipment, not the lungs of the people who are working in these buildings where they are installed.
I'm in complete agreement with that. You're exactly right. I don't like to emphasize the point for obvious reasons. But you're exactly right.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, and where I lose sleep over it, I had colleagues years ago at the University of Pittsburgh from the infectious disease department, and I don't know whether that is possible, and I certainly don't want to give anybody any ideas, but from what I remember is that somebody who is good in microbiology and with a small investment, not hundreds of millions of dollars, basically in his garage with a computer and an incubator and a couple of animals, is it possible that somebody could tailor-make an agent, whether it's a bacterium or whether it's a virus, I don't care. Is it possible that somebody could make an agent and introduce that one via migrating birds or rats or mice? They are wonderful animals to distribute it. Do you think that is still possible and that can get undetected, can go undetected?
Well, the latter is certainly true, that it would go undetected.
Yeah.
Because it can be done in a very small environment.
That's what they said. They said anybody can do it.
Is it possible to come up with a truly novel organism? I suppose it is.
Yeah.
But there are perfectly bad pathogens out there already, anthrax being the leading one among them, that are naturally occurring in the soil, where you don't really have to worry about whether or not the organism is going to be infectious for humans. You already know that it is.
Yes.
So
you don't have to do the experiments.
You don't have to do the experiments, and then it just becomes a matter of how you distribute it.
Yeah.
All right.
To me, it's frightening, and in fact, I am surprised that nothing has happened in that direction, really.
I am as well, and I hope that nothing does happen.
Yeah.
Let me ask if we do have some kind of event. I know that hospitals and some of the indoor environmental quality people that we work with hospitals and advise them on ways of isolating these cases. Have you seen any improvement in that area? Are we, on a scale of 1 to 10, how far along are we in being able to maybe isolate some of these problems?
I think it's a rather fluid number. Certainly, after the heart-building anthrax letter attacks in 2003, there was a huge flurry of interest in precisely this question. And I think for a while, because it appeared in medical journals, because there were continuing medical education courses and articles that appeared, people were a bit more up to speed. But memories fade very quickly. Other problems are certainly more pressing than bioterrorism or even novel infectious disease. And I'm afraid we've sort of slid backwards again. I'm not the least bit confident that if we had an unusual pathogen or a bioterrorism pathogen, that it would be recognized. I am modestly confident that if we had a simple syndrome-based, not a disease-based, but a simple syndrome-based reporting system where a doctor could effectively push a button, answer a few questions in 15 seconds, on cases that simply struck him as being unusual. Doctors are very good at saying there's something weird going on here. They may not know what it is, but they're very sensitive to and actually very accurate in identifying something strange going on. Then, if there's a cluster, 2, 3, 4 cases in a city the size of Pittsburgh, then the really knowledgeable people about bioterrorism, since you're focusing specifically on that, who are in public health, would be alerted to the fact that there is an unusual cluster. They would be the ones who would make the diagnosis quickly. But they have to be alerted to the cluster, and they're not being.
And I think the huge difficulty is if you have 3 top-notch hospitals, and there's one case in each of one of them, how do they communicate? I said, I have seen a strange thing. They don't.
Well, that's right, and that's precisely.
They don't make phone calls.
They don't. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
They don't make phone calls because they don't have the time.
Right.
That is the problem that we have bridged and solved. I would contend with the Cirrus system. because it's in multiple hospitals, because it's on multiple doctors' offices' desks, as soon as a case is reported, that case shows up on a map. Now, the clinical details and the name of the doctor who reported it is only available to the local public health official, but everybody can see that a case of severe hepatitis was just reported in Allegheny County. Well, maybe one case doesn't mean anything, but two do, or three would, and if the public health official looks at those three cases and sees that they're all in daycare centers, we have the diagnosis immediately, don't we? And if they're not all in daycare centers, if they're in 3 adults, then something very strange is going on.
Cliff, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, absolutely. My question's really financial. You know, I'm a sympathetic guy and I'm a charitable guy. And, you know, had I, like you, developed a system like this, you know, I wouldn't have tried to donate it, you know, for free to the government. I would have, you know, tried to, you know, as an entrepreneur, I would have tried to somehow financially benefited from that. You know, what was your motivation to, you know, spend all this time and effort developing this and then, you know, just give it away?
Well, initially, some of the work was sponsored by the U.S. government in a very pilot like way. But the problem was so severe, especially in light of the fact that we were and still are at war, that it struck me that the risks were just extremely high, that more than usual, that we might be dealing with, if not a bioterrorism event, a confounding event that might make us think we were dealing with a bioterrorism event. Now, there is a company that has purchased the software and is now marketing it and does in fact sell it, license it, but it's at a very modest cost. The actual cost of operating the SIRA software for a public health jurisdiction, let's say Allegheny County, is between 10 and 15 cents per person per year. So in a county that has, what's your population in Allegheny County now?
Let's say 1 million. Make it easy.
It's what, about 1 million?
Yeah,
Right.
Greater Pittsburgh area, yeah.
So we're talking about $100,000 a year to operate the system, and that's everything. That's including full IT support. There's no need to have a database or a server running it. The company that markets it, which is called Ares Corporation, does all of this, and it's extremely attractive. Doctors like it. They actually use it, unlike their interaction with a public health system on a traditional basis, whereas your expert correctly pointed out, doctors don't make phone calls. They don't need one more darn phone call to make or you put on hold trying to reach a public health official. With Cirrus, that's not necessary. It's a couple of clicks on the computer, poof, their case shows up on a map, and they can see if there are any other cases that are similar to theirs because it's instantaneously reflected on the map. The specific clinical details, of course, any confidential information is protected so that there's never been a violation of patient confidentiality with the system. But it does facilitate instantaneous communication between and among public health officials and doctors.
Are there any questions we didn't ask or issues that you'd like to comment on before we go?
Just one point. Every year, the Congress takes up in health appropriations bills funding for disease surveillance, and some of it is done in the context of the Defense Act that is passed every year, literally to address the bioterrorism problem, and some is done for traditional public health. I would encourage anybody who's actually interested enough or concerned enough about this hole that we have in our surveillance to simply suggest that a controlled trial be done. So the University of Pittsburgh has a system that I'm familiar with. I went to medical school there, and they have a disease surveillance system that is based essentially on diagnosis codes. It's called RODS, R-O-D-S. And it's one of many systems like it that is based on diagnosis codes. I don't believe that it has the ability to make a diagnosis or to notify people that something unusual is happening within hours. Their claim is that they can do it within a few days, and I believe they probably can within a few days, but that's not good enough. What I would like to see happen is a head-to-head trial. a so-called controlled scientific trial, where for a few $100,000 in a city like Pittsburgh that already has one kind of surveillance system running, to introduce a Cirrus-like system, which depends on the doctor doing direct reporting when they think something unusual is going on, as opposed to checking off a diagnosis code that gets buried with thousands of other diagnosis codes, and see which system performs better over the course of a year. It would cost us practically nothing. It would teach us a great deal, and all that would be required would be enough open-mindedness on the part of both academicians and public health officials to do a head-to-head test. And Pittsburgh's the perfect place to do it because there's already one kind of disease surveillance going on there. Let's test it against the system that is running in Texas, where we have had demonstrable successes, and see if there are other things we can learn, and perhaps the systems are complementary.
I guess a question, have you ever related with Dr. Dixon, Bruce Dixon, with the county health department? It would seem that he might be the person that might be
Indeed I have.
Okay.
Indeed I have. I know Bruce well because when I was a medical student at the University of Pittsburgh, he was my attending physician. He was the first doctor that I had contact with when I started my clinical rotations at the university, and I hold him in very high regard. And he and I were on a panel together about 2 years ago, sponsored by Cyril Wecht, on the problem of bioterrorism at Duquesne University. And I suggested it to Bruce, and I think he's actually interested. And he's certainly the kind of thoughtful, most people, I certainly would characterize him as brilliant clinician who would be open to the possibility of trying two alternatives at the same time and seeing which one plays out. But I don't think it's within Bruce's ability to simply make this happen.
Gotcha.
I think he needs other people behind him, but I think he's probably open to it. He's certainly more than capable of understanding the pluses and minuses of both approaches.
How can our listeners contact you, Doctor?
Well, they can certainly feel free to go to my website, which is www.zelicoff.com. That's Zelicoff, 2 F's like in Friday. And my contact information is there, my email and my business phone.
So the first letter is Z, not S.
That's right.
Okay.
Z,
okay.
like in zebra.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks so much to Dr. Zelicoff. And we've got another show we did with him just recently, so check that out when you get a chance. I want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. And I also want to mention that next week we've got a great show lined up. We have Larry Sloan, the executive director of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They've had to go to an online webinar type setup for their conference this year. We're going to talk a little bit about how the coronavirus has affected AIHA, talk a little bit about some of the programs they have there that are available for people working in this area. So should be an excellent interview. Before we go, I want to thank our growing group of loyal listeners. Please come back next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.